Psalm 142. With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me.
Be seated, please. I guess in life, we realize that what we plan or what we think that our lives may be, and then what they sometimes turn out to be, are two totally different things. Just recently, someone was reflecting on their ideas of what it was going to be like to be married, to have children, to have grandchildren, to be involved in not only their lives, but the lives of others around them. And they reflected, in the midst of everything, you never know. You actually never know what exactly will take place. All of us as parents understand that the little babes in our arms becomes something else when they grow up, when they begin to have minds and legs and arm strength to be able to go where they want to go instead of where you want them to go. And the same is true as they deal with the teenage years of life and then the adult years of life, and on it goes. This afternoon, we're going to be dealing with a very interesting psalm. If you read the superscription there in the top of the psalm, mine says, a maskil of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. I quickly looked up some interesting facts about caves. I can't recall that I've been in many of them in my life. They are formed from pressure, erosion from water, volcanoes, tectonic plate movements, chemical actions, as well as microorganisms. That's the way caves can be formed. Most caves of rock formations deal with such things as limestone, which we know a lot about here in our area, marble, dolomite, as well as gypsum. Now, the deepest cave that we know about is over in Georgia, the Varana Cave, 7,208 feet underground. I recall years ago, my parents were out west in one of the very famous caves out there, and they turned the lights out so that everyone would know that to see what utter darkness was like. And as they turned the lights back on and started looking around, someone turned and said, "Are you Joe Williams?" And Dad turned, and it happened to be some friends of his. They were schoolmates at Freed-Hardeman College 35, 40, probably at that time, probably 60 years ago. But at the bottom of a cave, they got to reunite and be friends. Well, we often say that a man's house is his castle, But as it turned out here for David, his was not so much a house as it was a cave. We typically think that this is the occasion, or one of those occasions, that David is running for his life because of Saul. Saul's anger and jealousy and rage at what the people were saying about David. He's killed his 10,000, Saul's killed his thousands. The way that Saul eyed David, the text tells us, often on several occasions tried to kill him because of his jealousy and his rage of all the things that the people were saying about him. And David would often run away from Saul, and his band of individuals were with him. On one occasion, David is inside of a cave. We don't know how deep, we don't know how dark, we don't know what it was like. If you've ever spent any kind of time in a cave, then you can know based upon the groundwater and other such things that it can be a very damp, a very cold kind of place. And likely some of us, at least figuratively speaking, have understood what it's like to be inside of a cave. In South Alabama one time, I was dealing with some individuals in regard to a grief class. And I asked them the simple question, today, what is your grief like? I'll never forget their answer. It is like being at the bottom of a cave with no light at all, and you really do not know which way is up and which way is down. And for their life at that point in time, and dealing with a horrific death experience of their adult child, that's exactly the way they felt. Perhaps you've been there as well. Perhaps whatever situation, whatever challenge that you have faced, or loved ones that you have had to deal with and face together, you sometimes feel like you're inside of a cave. Like you don't know whether it's even safe to come out again, like that of David. When trouble comes our way, what are we supposed to remember? Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge, and He's a very present help in time of trouble. We've sung about very well being nearer to God and the idea of what it's like to be close to God. James reminds us, count it all joy, because when you deal with various trials of life, in fact, James goes on to say, look, when you deal with those various trials of life, and understand that perhaps there's a God always there trying to help you through your problems of life. This afternoon, what we want to do is just look at the psalm itself. First of all, how David felt, and he tells us how he felt. First of all, verse 3 tells us he felt very much trapped, weak. You see, likely Saul and his army was looking for David. And they likely there in the wilderness of Judea were going from cave to cave to cave, trying to find where David must have been. In it, he also felt very alone. Look at verse 4. I looked to the right and saw there's none who took nearest to me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. On several occasions, if you'll go back to 1 and 2 Samuel, as well as in Chronicles, David would sometimes go and hide out himself. Other times, he would have others to go with him. But here, evidently, he's saying, look, everywhere I look, there's nobody that cares for me. Wouldn't that be a sad commentary of life? Particularly for someone like David who had faith and trust in God, not to find anybody that cared for him. Again, perhaps in this audience today, you may have been that way. It is easy. It is rather easy to get in such despair and despondency and the problems of how horrific they may seem, to feel like that there's no one that cares for you. David also felt very much persecuted. Again, verse 6, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors. Notice what he says. For they are too strong for me. Whether it was 1 against 10 or 1 against 20 or 1 against 100, David felt, I'm not going to win this battle. Lord, I know I've been victorious through your help on various occasions. I killed the great giant Goliath. I did all the other things. But I'm not going to make it out of this one alive. He felt likely that he was in prison and he was trapped. You ever been in a situation that you felt like that you had no way or nowhere to go? Maybe it was some kind of financial situation. Maybe it was some kind of physical ailment or news that would come from a doctor. Maybe it was some kind of grief loss that you were dealing with. Maybe it was some kind of family conflict that you were having to deal with. And the point that David is saying is, there's no way out of here. There's no place for me to be able to go. He felt like he was at the end of his rope. And it's well and good for us when we sometimes say to someone when they're depressed or when they're dealing with issues of life, well, what you need to do is you need to take that rope and tie a knot and hang on. You know, that sounds good, but you being there by yourself, it's much harder. It's much more difficult, and likely some of us have been there before. So first of all, David tells us how he felt. And I think the lesson there for us today is this. It does not bother God for us to tell him how we feel. It really does not. Remember how Luke records and tells us there in the Garden of Gethsemane how he described Jesus? How that the sweat came off of his brow like that of blood? How that he fell to his knees? How that he was sorrowful and greatly disturbed? God cares. He cares for us in regard to how we feel. And even if those feelings are not totally correct, at that point in time, they're real. And they're as real as you and I are living. But secondly, notice what David did. And I think there's some things there that we need to understand. It's okay to feel what we feel when we're dealing with some kind of issue of life. But it's also important for us to do something about it. And notice what the text tells us. First of all, David said, I cry out. And according to the original language, he howled like an animal. I mean, this was not just, oh Lord, I don't feel very good. This was a persistent, constant, real feeling that he had. When someone treats you unjustly and unkindly, or someone that you love, when something happens to you that through no fault at all of you and your loved ones, it sort of makes you feel like you've been mistreated. But notice he also pled for mercy. Wonder why David felt like he needed mercy. You know, we don't know everything about David and Saul's life. We know that both of them were imperfect individuals. One obviously much evidently more so than the other. But in David's situation, in the midst of hiding in a cave, remember on one other occasion, he's inside of a cave and Saul comes in. I know I'm among mixed audience, so let's just say he was using the restroom. And David was so close, he could have killed him with a sword easily. And yet he chose not to do so. He just cut off a little part of his robe. And then he even repented himself of that because he had done that against, as he calls him, the Lord's anointed one. David knew that he wasn't perfect and he needed mercy. You know, a lot of times we plead for others to receive justice, but you think about it, we all need mercy. And that's what David had said on this occasion. I plead with my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord, verse 1. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Does God get tired of us telling him how we feel and what we're going through in life? I really don't think he does. Because the point of the matter is, we do find it to be somewhat helpful to be able to, after dealing with the problems of life, to let them know, Lord, here are the things that are wrong. Now, it's one thing to complain, it's another thing to do something about that, and we'll get there just in a moment. But on this occasion, that's exactly what David did. He felt one way. Lord, I want to tell you, here's all the things that have been done to me. And as again, from what we read in the narratives, Saul had done a lot of wrong and not much right toward David because of his envy and his jealousy toward him. You know, sometimes when we really care for someone else, we need to ask that much more penetrating question than just, how are you doing? We need to ask the question, how are you really doing? And then listen. And we will have paid that individual the greatest compliment in all the world. Because it's one thing to ask the question, how are you doing? And for someone to say very quickly, oh, I'm fine, and we, in our brains, check them off as if we have already done our duty and move on. Here's David, line by line. Lord, here's all the problems that I have. I'm telling him my trouble. Wonder why David did that. Do you think he probably had the idea that God cared enough to listen? Oh, I know he had a special relationship with God, unlike what we do today in some ways. But we sing the song, does Jesus care? And we know that he does. The same is true for David toward God. I tell my trouble to him. I must tell Jesus all of my sorrow, all of my troubles. Jesus will listen. Jesus alone. We sometimes sing the song. Don't we serve a great God? Aren't we grateful that we have that kind of God that listens? And as we, his representatives in the church, should do, to really care and to really listen and to really be there for someone as they talk about their troubles of life. David felt one way. He did something else about it. And then we want to look at where he looked. And the very first thing that he did was to look to God and to trust. You see, David had been with God, or I should say it the other way around. God had been with David through everything in life. Remember in 2 Samuel, or 1 Samuel chapter 17, when David is trying to convince Saul to let him go fight the giant Goliath? He says, look, the same God that was with me when a bear attacked me when he was attacking my sheep, or the lion that attacked me, were attacking my sheep, that's the same God that's going to go out with me in battle to fight against this Philistine giant. In other words, David was saying, I can trust God. And I would hope and I would pray that we would feel the same kind of trust that we have in God as David did. And thus, instead of making it all about him, he'd already talked about himself. He'd already talked about how he felt. There's 4 different statements there in Psalm 142 that, as it were, he says, God, I know I'm not the solution, but you are. And that's why he could trust in him. Look at verse 3. You know my way. In other words, you know what predicament I'm in. You know what's happened in the past. You know what's happening in the present. And God, you also know what's going to happen in the future. You know my way. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, in him there is light and there is no darkness at all in him, is what John said about God. And even though perhaps David was hiding in a deep, dark cave of darkness, he knew that God was the light at the end of the way. He says in verse 5, you're my refuge and you're my portion. You know, the word refuge is a rather interesting word. It refers to a place of rest, a place of security, a place that we go to when everything's wrong. Remember as a kid when you had one of those terrible, horrible, awful days and everything that could have gone wrong did? And you got up in mom's lap. And if mom wasn't around, you got in dad's lap and hope for the best. But you got in mom's lap, and everything was all right. Because mom can make it all good. Mom was your refuge. That's the kind of relationship that David had. You're my portion. You're my security. And then look at what he says in verse 6. You hear me when I cry. When a kid cries, when a child cries, every mom and every dad, it doesn't matter if every other, maybe you got 10 kids crying in the same classroom, every mom and every dad knows the cry of their own child. We do that perhaps by instinct. Because we know that one's mine. They belong to me. I've got to go take care of them. The Bible tells us that God counts our tears and puts them in his bottle, also found in the book of Psalms. And David here is saying, Lord, you're hearing me as I cry. And then notice the rest of that verse, you deliver me. My enemies are around me. They're too strong. There's no way that I can get away from them, Lord. But I know you're hearing this. And I know that it's going to turn out okay. In fact, look at verse 7. Bring me out of prison that I may give thanks to your name The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. I mean, David's already figured it out. I know I'm in this cave, and I know I can't see, and I know the enemy's out there, and I know what my troubles are, I know how I feel, and I know what I've done, but I also know where to look. You know, there's some lessons, I think, from some caves experiences. First of all, they give you a different perspective, do they not? We all have our own opinions of how we ought to parent our children, and then we get our own kids, and it all becomes a little bit more different, does it? It's a little more real because we understand, wow, this is my child. This is our child. This is what this is all about. Well, Cave's experience is the same way. But they give you a perspective that perhaps you've never had before. Thankfully, most problems of life will begin to desist if we give our time and we give our effort to them. But through it all, we need to understand that there is a God that cares. And if we will look for them, and I think sometimes we have to look for them, we'll learn some things that will be very helpful, both about ourselves and, more importantly, about our God. I wish we had an addendum to Psalm 142 that said, and the people and the enemies of God did not find David, and David came out, and David praised and worshiped God. I think likely we can surmise that that's exactly what David would have done. But the point of the matter is, there is not any darkness, any cave experience in this world that's going to negate or erase away the God that's in our heart and in our life. Jesus said it this way, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. It would be wrong of me as a child of God, and certainly as a minister, to say that you will, if you follow Christ and try to walk in the light of His Word, that you will never have any problems of life. That would be wrong for me to say that. Because Jesus said in other places, in this world you will have tribulation. But, and that's a good but, be of good cheer, because I've overcome the world, John 16:33. And if Jesus could overcome this world, that means that we can as well through His help and through our trust and our faith in God, that He will be merciful. If you're in this audience this afternoon and you need that kind of trust and that kind of hope and that kind of mercy, and you've not yet claimed it because you're not a New Testament Christian, why would you be waiting any longer? And if you need to come back and start again a better relationship with Jesus, do so right now so that we stand and sing the invitation song. Won't you come?